The tensions between Russia and Ukraine, the ever-evolving conflicts within the South China Sea, and the rising heat between Israel and Palestine. In an era marked by rapid globalization and interconnectedness, the persistence of global conflicts poses a significant challenge to international stability and cooperation. Today we'll be talking about the disputes surrounding Russia and Ukraine, the South China Sea, and Israel and Palestine. We'll be exploring its roots, global impact, and possible hopes for peace. Russia-Ukraine tensions. On February 24, 2022, Russia started a military operation in Ukraine, with forces moving from Belarus in the north, Russia in the east, and Crimea in the south. President Putin described it as a special military operation intended at defending Donbass residents and demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. He claimed that Russia had no intention of occupying Ukrainian land or forcing its will on anyone. However, in the past 2 years, Russian forces have launched a full-scale attack on Ukraine. In early October 2022, Russia signed treaties to annex Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, declaring them part of Russia, even though these areas remain partially under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainian government has committed to regaining all of its territories, including Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. However, Russia's administration insists that these acquired territories will remain part of Russia permanently. Despite facing military problems, both sides are determined to win decisively, with little interest in compromise or peace discussions. At the request of Ukraine, a global peace summit aimed at sparking a future peace process was held in Switzerland on June 15 and 16, 2024. However, Russia was not invited, raising doubts about what the summit could truly accomplish. In response, President Putin proposed his own terms for a ceasefire and peace talks, but Ukraine and its allies dismissed them as an ultimatum rather than a genuine attempt at compromise. 2 years after Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine has regained 54% of the occupied land, while Russia still controls 18% of the country. Ukraine's counteroffensive has slowed down, and Russia has opened a new front in the northeastern Kharkiv region. Russia continues to bombard Ukrainian cities and block ports, while Ukraine has increased drone attacks on Russian ships and infrastructure. Since January 2022, Ukraine has received around $278 billion in aid, including $75 billion from the United States, though there are concerns about donor fatigue. The conflict and airstrikes have caused countless casualties, displaced 3.7 million people within Ukraine, and forced 6.5 million to flee the country. South China Sea disputes. The South China Sea is a key shipping route, with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development estimating that over 21% of global trade, worth $3.37 trillion, passed through these waters in 2016. It also boasts rich fishing grounds that support millions of people in the region, with more than half of the world's fishing vessels operating there. Countries have argued over territory in the South China Sea for centuries, but tensions have risen recently. China's broad claims, which include control over both land and surrounding waters, have angered other claimants like Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Brunei. These countries have also staked claims to islands and various zones, while China has supported its claims with island building and naval patrols. In more recent events, ABC News reports that the United States, Australia, Canada, and the Philippines conducted air and naval exercises earlier this August to demonstrate their commitment to upholding the rule of law in the disputed South China Sea, where China has been increasingly asserting its territorial claims. In what seemed to be a response, the country has announced that it carried out air and sea combat patrols on the same day. Israel-Palestine conflict. The attack launched by Hamas on Israel on October 7th of last year has led the Israel Defense Forces to carry out aerial and ground operations in the Gaza Strip. On June 8th, the IDF carried out a mission in central Gaza to rescue 4 hostages, during which Gazan authorities reported 274 Palestinian deaths and hundreds of injuries. Efforts to free the more than 100 remaining Israeli and foreign hostages taken by Hamas have mostly failed, and their whereabouts and well-being remain unknown. Since October 2023, nearly 2 million Gazans, over 85% of the population, have been displaced from their homes. Additionally, the crisis has heightened regional tensions throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah forces in Lebanon have clashed with the IDF. Yemen's Houthi rebels have fired missiles toward Israel and commercial ships in the Red Sea, and Iran-backed militias have launched scores of attacks on U.S. military sites in Iraq and Syria. As of early August this year, the situation is as follows, as reported by news channel Al Jazeera English. Israel reports that it has killed a Hamas official in Sidon, southern Lebanon, raising fears of a broader regional conflict. Thousands of Palestinians are fleeing Han Yunis in southern Gaza as Israeli forces target around 30 sites and issue new evacuation orders. And at least 39,699 people have died, and 91,722 have been injured in the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Russia-Ukraine tensions. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has deep roots. Their shared history spans over 1,000 years, with both sides viewing it differently. In the past century, Ukraine was a major and influential republic in the former USSR, known for its agriculture and as Europe's breadbasket, until it gained independence in 1991, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, as cited by U.S. News and World Report. Since then, Russia has closely watched its western neighbor, while Ukraine has experienced a rocky path to independence, marked by protests and government corruption at various times. Additionally, Ukraine's desire to align more with Western countries, including its interest in joining NATO, which was partly created to counter Soviet expansion, has triggered Russia's aggression. Tensions peaked in 2014 when Ukrainians removed a president who was friendly to Russia. Claiming to protect ethnic Russians and Russian speakers from persecution, Russia annexed Crimea, a move widely condemned internationally. Around the same time, Russia stirred unrest in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, supporting a separatist movement in Donetsk and Luhansk, which led to armed conflict. These regions declared independence, and both sides became entrenched in a long-standing standoff. South China Sea disputes. China's broad claims to sovereignty across the sea have enraged rival claimants Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. No country was given clear ownership over the South China Sea, and in 1947, China made a bold move by declaring the 9-dotted line that covers almost the entire sea. This claim became known as the 9-dash line. In the 1970s, various countries started claiming islands and areas in the South China Sea, like the Spratly Islands. In 1982, the United Nations established exclusive economic zones. Shortly after, China reaffirmed its 9-dash line claim, refusing to define its limits and rejecting the claims of other countries. Additionally, China argues that international law prevents foreign militaries from conducting intelligence-gathering activities, like reconnaissance flights, in its EEZ. The United States, however, claims that under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, countries have the right to freedom of navigation through EEZs and do not need to inform claimants of military activities. In recent years, satellite data has revealed China's growing efforts to recover territory in the South China Sea by physically expanding existing islands or building new ones entirely. In addition to putting sand onto existing reefs, China has built ports, military stations, and airstrips. Israel-Palestine conflict. The origins of this conflict can vary depending on whom you ask. Some trace it back to the Romans, while others begin with the Jewish migration to the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century. For this overview, we'll follow the Guardian's timeline, which starts with the 1947 United Nations vote to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, after the Holocaust devastated European Jewry. Neither the Palestinians nor the neighboring Arab countries accepted the creation of modern Israel. Conflict grew between Jewish armed groups, some of which the British labeled as terrorist organizations, and Palestinians. After Israel declared independence in May 1948, the armies of Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, and Syria invaded. As Israel's new army made gains, a 1949 armistice agreement set new borders that gave Israel more territory than it had under the UN partition plan. In 1964, a group of Palestinian organizations formed the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, to fight for an Arab state instead of Israel. the PLO gained international attention with notable attacks and hijackings. The PLO was mainly a secular organization inspired by other leftist guerrilla movements of the time, though most of its supporters were Muslim. Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood had traditionally steered clear of armed conflict, focusing instead on creating a more religious society. However, this changed under Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, a charismatic quadriplegic from Gaza. Shortly after the First Intifada began, Yassin used support for Mujama al-Islamiyah as the basis to form Hamas in 1987, joining forces with other Islamist groups. Israel has consistently denied supporting the rise of the Islamist movement in Gaza, but it saw these groups as a way to weaken the PLO's influence and recognized Mujama al-Islamiyah as a charity, allowing it to operate freely and gain support. This chapter explores the global impact of these ground-shaking conflicts. While these disputes have various effects on a global scale, we'll be looking at three for each one: their repercussions on global stability, the economy, and international relations. Russia-Ukraine tensions. In terms of global stability, trust has clearly been undermined. The war has deeply damaged faith in international agreements and institutions. The Institute of Central Europe reports that Russia's aggression towards Ukraine has not only sped up the breakdown of the international order, but also reduced trust in international organizations. Other than the erosion of trust, the invasion of Ukraine has challenged the core principles of territorial integrity and self-determination. Eamon Ryan, Ireland's Minister for the Environment, Climate, Communications and Transport, stated that Russia's war is not just against the people of Ukraine, but also against the United Nations Charter and the multilateral system. It has openly violated the Charter's principles of sovereign equality, the territorial integrity of states, and the obligation of all nations to avoid threats or the use of force against each other. When examining the war's impact on global economies, we can focus on three main areas. First is the economic downturn. The International Monetary Fund highlights three key effects. Firstly, higher prices for essentials like food and energy will increase inflation, reducing the value of incomes and decreasing demand. Secondly, neighboring economies will struggle with disrupted trade, broken supply chains, and a historic rise in refugee numbers. And lastly, reduced business confidence and greater investor uncertainty will lead to lower asset prices, tighter financial conditions, and possible capital outflows from emerging markets. Second area of impact is food security. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Russia and Ukraine are key to global food supply, with Russia being the largest wheat exporter and Ukraine the fifth. Together, they provide 19% of barley, 14% of wheat, and 4% of maize, making up over 1/3 of global cereal exports. Thirdly, the war also affects the world's energy market volatility. The World Economic Forum reports that price swings, supply shortages, security issues, and economic uncertainty have led to what the International Energy Agency describes as the first truly global energy crisis, with effects expected to last for years. Moving on to the last point of discussion for the Ukraine-Russia war, when it comes to international relations, we can look at a few areas. First, the realignment of alliances within countries. The war has sped up changes in global alliances, with countries forming closer ties with those who share their political views. Secondly, the weakening of multilateralism, as the conflict has put a strain on multilateral institutions and diplomacy, as nations focus more on their own interests rather than working together. The UN has called the war a stark reminder of the challenges facing multilateralism. And lastly, the war may lead to a new geopolitical landscape, creating a more fragmented and competitive global environment. South China Sea disputes. Let's look at the dispute's impact on global stability. The conflict has raised regional tensions, especially due to overlapping claims and aggressive actions, particularly by China. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea has increased tensions with Southeast Asian countries, especially the Philippines at the Second Thomas Shoal in the Spratly Islands. Additionally, military buildups and confrontations in the area could lead to potential armed conflict. The dispute has also weakened international law. China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea challenge established laws, especially regarding exclusive economic zones, creating uncertainty and undermining global order. The International Crisis Group notes that China's actions affect other countries' rights to their maritime areas. This situation raises the risk of a larger conflict, potentially involving regional powers or even external actors like the United States, with serious consequences for both the region and the world. Diving into the second point of interest when it comes to the global economy, we can look at how the conflict has disrupted trading for the region and beyond. The South China Sea is a crucial shipping route for global trade. According to the Vision of Humanity, based on the Business and Peace 2024 report, the conflict has led to decreased trade due to infrastructure damage, supply chain issues, and increased security measures, which raise transportation and transaction costs and impact import prices. The dispute also heightens competition for resources, as the South China Sea is thought to have significant oil and gas reserves. In 2023, 10 billion barrels of oil and 6.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas passed through this area. The scramble for these resources could further increase tensions and destabilize the region. Moving on to international relations, the conflict has intensified competition between major world powers, with the South China Sea becoming a key battleground between China and the United States. The U.S. has formed alliances with countries like the Philippines, affecting the global balance of power. Additionally, the dispute has led to stronger partnerships among countries in the region and beyond as they try to counter China's influence. For instance, in August of this year, the U.S., Australia, Canada, and the Philippines conducted joint naval and air exercises in the contested waters. Israel-Palestine conflict. When talking about the war's impact on global stability, the UN has highlighted the risks of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict destabilizing the wider region. Khalid Kiari, UN Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East and Asia and the Pacific, described the situation as alarming, with ongoing clashes between Israeli forces and Hamas in Gaza. The conflict also raises concerns about the U.S. potentially becoming more involved in a broader military conflict. According to the Wilson Center, by October 2023, the Pentagon had deployed 2 carrier strike groups with over 150 warplanes and numerous missiles, along with 2,000 troops, to help prevent escalation and protect its forces in the volatile region. As for the war's impact on global economies, the Wilson Center cited a World Bank report from October 2023, warning that the conflict between Israel and Gaza could lead to a global economic shock. This might include oil prices spiking to $150 a barrel and millions facing hunger due to higher food costs. The situation could echo the 1973 crisis when Arab OPEC members, led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an oil embargo on the U.S. in response to American support for Israel. Bloomberg News adds that conflict in the Middle East can have global repercussions because the region is vital for energy and shipping. With the world economy still recovering from inflation worsened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, another war in an energy-rich area could drive inflation up again. Lastly, on the topic of international relations, the crisis has significantly impacted the region and its neighbors. According to Ambassador Hesham Youssef at the United States Institute of Peace, the humanitarian disaster and Israeli military actions are raising fears of mass displacement in Egypt and Jordan. After an Israeli military spokesman suggested that Palestinians fleeing Gaza should go to Egypt, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi stated that Egypt would not solve the problem at others' expense. Meanwhile, King Abdullah II of Jordan has warned that displacing 1 million Palestinians is a red line, worried that Israel might pressure Jordan to accept large numbers of West Bank Palestinians while it deals with extremist groups there. Russia-Ukraine tensions. Efforts to end the Russia-Ukraine war have made little progress. Initial talks in Belarus produced a draft agreement that was never fully carried out. Recently, the Politico reported that Russia was not invited to the peace summit in Switzerland, which it dismissed as biased toward Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky told Reuters in May, "You cannot sit down to talk to a person whose only goal is to destroy you." Additionally, various international players have tried to mediate the conflict. Turkey, for example, has facilitated prisoner exchanges and helped broker a deal for Ukrainian grain exports through the Black Sea. The UN has reported that global leaders and officials are calling for an immediate ceasefire and peace talks, condemning the attacks on civilians and warning of the risk of escalating into a global conflict. The UN Security Council has addressed the crisis twice in 1 week, discussing its impact on the region and the world. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres remarked, "The guns are talking now, but in the end we all know that the path of diplomacy and accountability is the road to a just and sustainable peace." Despite these attempts, the conflict is escalating, with both sides inflicting severe losses and causing enormous damage. The prospects for a negotiated settlement are dreary as Russia and Ukraine's stances remain far apart. South China Sea disputes. As for the South China Sea, the dispute has seen ongoing diplomatic efforts for decades, but progress has been slow and challenging. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations has been leading these efforts, working with China since 2018 to create a code of conduct to peacefully manage disputes. Despite some progress, finalizing the COC remains difficult due to different views on maritime rights and sovereignty. Additionally, individual countries with claims in the area have held separate talks with China, such as the agreement between the Philippines and China for joint oil exploration. However, these agreements often face implementation issues and obstacles. It is also worth mentioning that the conflict in the South China Sea has spurred the involvement of multiple nations. The United States, as a key regional power, has been involved through freedom of navigation operations and diplomatic pressure on China. Other major powers like Japan, India, and Australia have also shown concern, aiming to keep a balance of power in the region. As the dispute continues, increased militarization and competition among these powers add complexity. Resolving the South China Sea issue will likely be a long-term effort, requiring ongoing diplomatic work and a commitment to peaceful cooperation. Israel-Palestine conflict. And lastly, the recent escalation between Hamas and Israel has reignited discussions about restarting the long-stalled peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. The UN Secretary-General has emphasized that a lasting resolution can only be achieved through a two-state solution. Despite this, Israeli leaders have repeatedly rejected this approach, especially amid the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has firmly stated that rejecting the two-state solution is unacceptable and must be addressed to move forward. Also, earlier this year, the United States introduced a final draft of a UN Security Council resolution aiming to establish an immediate and sustained ceasefire. This resolution is part of an effort to secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas during their attack on southern Israel on October 7th. According to AP News, the U.S. had circulated an initial draft on February 19th, just before vetoing an Arab-backed resolution that called for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S. argued that the resolution would interfere with ongoing hostage negotiations. This veto marked the third time the U.S. blocked a Security Council resolution for a Gaza ceasefire, placing President Joe Biden's administration at odds with much of the international community, including several allies. It goes without saying that these conflicts have reached far beyond their borders, having ripple effects across the entire globe. We can only continue to hope that these tensions ease as time passes so that the world would, once again, know peace. Thank you for watching.